Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping into a part of history that doesn't get talked about much. Not because it's unknown, but because it makes people uncomfortable. In ancient China, male concubines were chosen for their beauty and silence. They weren't servants. They weren't lovers. They were something else entirely. Something harder to name. Their lives weren't written down. Their stories weren't meant to last. But for centuries, they existed. Behind closed doors, behind painted walls, behind everything we like to call civilization. So take a breath. Let the room go quiet. Dim the lights, and we'll begin. In some parts of ancient China, the beginning was always the same, a season of drought or flood or disease, a harvest that never came. A family sitting in silence around a fire that barely warmed the room, counting rice grains and wondering what could be traded, what could be spared. Daughters might be married off early or sent to wealthier relatives as servants. But sons, especially the youngest, especially the most beautiful, were worth something else entirely. There were men in the cities, they had heard, who would pay for boys, not to work the fields or carry bricks, but to be kept. These men had wealth beyond imagining, silk that spilled across the floor, gold bowls, music in the morning. And for reasons the villagers didn't ask too many questions about, these men were willing to pay a high price for quiet, delicate boys with soft skin and good posture. So when the choice came, lose the child to hunger or sell him for silver, some parents made the only decision they thought they had. It didn't happen all at once. At first, it was just whispers. A neighbor's cousin had done it. Someone downriver came back with a heavy purse and wouldn't say how. And then the buyers began to arrive themselves, or more accurately, their agents. Well-dressed men with clean fingernails and quiet voices. They came with compliments and questions, but rarely gave straight answers. They walked through the muddy lanes of starving villages with a kind of dispassionate patience, like choosing fruit at market. They asked to see the sons. They looked closely at eyes, hands, teeth. They watched how a boy stood, how he bowed, how he responded when spoken to. They sometimes brought food, sometimes gifts. And always, they carried small chests of silver, which they opened with ceremony just before producing the contracts. Long, folded documents written in language most villagers couldn't read. The terms were vague, but full of promises. The boy would live in a fine house. He would be educated. He would never go hungry again. The parents, numb with worry, signed their names or marked the paper with trembling hands. The boy was taken the same day. In wealthier cities, the demand had already formed. It didn't come from nowhere. The ruling classes had always kept entertainers, servants, dancers. But at some point, aesthetics shifted. The lines between servant and ornament blurred. What began as companionship turned into something else. Young men, trained, obedient, graceful, were seen not only as household additions, but as a kind of status symbol. Just as a man might collect rare porcelain or breed singing birds, he might also keep a boy whose presence was meant to please the eye, flatter the host, and never disrupt the air of cultivated silence. Word of this demand spread slowly but surely into the countryside. The price for a healthy, well-featured boy rose. The trade grew informal networks, go-betweens, scouts, brokers. Some families began preparing their sons from an early age, teaching them manners, posture, how to recite lines of poetry or hold a teacup properly. Not out of cruelty, but hope. Hope that if the boy were sold, he might fetch enough to save the rest. The system sustained itself because it was efficient. Poverty fed it. Vanity maintained it. and silence protected it. The boys, once sold, vanished from village memory within weeks. Their names were rarely spoken aloud again, not out of shame, but out of necessity. There was work to do, mouths to feed, and in the cities, the boys were dressed in silk, renamed, and placed in rooms that were beautiful and locked. They became part of a rhythm older than them, older than their buyers, older even than the dynasties themselves. A rhythm built on supply and demand, on wealth and desperation, on the quiet understanding that someone always has less, and someone else is always willing to pay. He was not chosen by accident. Everything about the ideal boy was deliberate, studied, evaluated like an object behind glass. It began with the skin. It had to be clear, unblemished, pale if possible, a sign of delicacy, of not having worked under the sun. A single mark, a freckle in the wrong place, a scar from a childhood fall, could mean rejection. The skin was the canvas. Buyers ran their fingers across arms and cheeks as if testing fabric. Smoothness mattered. Softness mattered. A certain warmth, too. Not feverish, not clammy. They spoke of skin like connoisseurs, compared tones and textures the way they compared lacquered wood or porcelain. But it didn't end there. The bones beneath the skin had to be right. A narrow waist, long limbs, fine wrists, straight back, balanced shoulders, delicate collarbones. The boys who passed inspection often didn't know why they were considered beautiful. They just stood still and tried not to breathe too loud. The face was its own category. Round faces were too childish, strong jaws too masculine. What they wanted was something between: oval shape, high cheekbones, pointed chin, small nose, lips that rested softly, never too wide or expressive. Eyes mattered more than anything. Almond-shaped was best. Slanted slightly upward, but not too much. Clear whites, dark irises, no visible blood vessels. The look had to be calm, receptive, and above all, obedient. A good boy didn't meet your gaze directly unless asked. He looked just enough to seem attentive, never enough to challenge. Eyebrows were to be arched, symmetrical, gently defined. Ears, too, had to be neat and close to the head. Hair was grown out long but kept silky and oiled, combed daily, wrapped with ribbon, or left loose depending on the master's taste. Even the angle of the neck, the way it tilted when the boy bowed, was noticed. Some boys were trained to hold a certain angle, just slightly downward, to appear more graceful when standing still. And then there was movement. No one wanted clumsiness, no sudden gestures. An ideal boy walked like a reed swaying in water, slow, fluid, almost too quiet to hear. His steps were short, deliberate, without bouncing. He knew how to fold his hands when standing. He knew how to sit without shifting weight or tapping his fingers. His voice was low, but not rough, melodic, but not loud. They taught him how to speak only when spoken to, and even then softly. Pronunciation mattered. A hint of southern dialect was sometimes considered charming, but only if it didn't distort the tones. Boys who sang well were considered more valuable. So were those who could laugh lightly or cry silently. Crying was never meant to disturb. A perfect boy could cry without contorting his face, just tears quietly, on command or by habit. Every physical detail was part of the evaluation, every habit a reflection of how well he would adapt to the role waiting for him behind the walls. What made it worse was how young they were when these expectations were first pressed upon them. Some boys were only 8 or 9 when they were first told to smile more softly, to keep their eyes lowered, to press their lips together at rest. They were taught that beauty wasn't about nature. It was about control. Control over the body, over expression, over presence. The most desired boys moved as though they didn't exist fully, like a candle's reflection on water, visible, flickering, but never solid enough to resist being shaped. This wasn't just about appearance, it was about submission disguised as elegance. Buyers wanted beauty they could own, beauty that didn't resist or demand, or age too quickly. And so the boys learned not just how to look beautiful, but how to be quiet inside their beauty, how to become part of the room, part of the decor, part of someone else's idea of perfection. They were called human teeth, not in jest, but as a job title, sharp and clinical. Men who made their living not by growing crops or trading goods, but by collecting people. They came to villages that didn't appear on maps, following rumors of famine, drought, or failed harvests. Their arrival was never announced. No banners, no messengers. Just a wagon in the distance, a man in fine shoes stepping down into the dust, a polite knock on a door that had never seen silk before. They dressed well, not extravagantly, but just enough to be noticed. Enough to make a starving parent feel seen, even flattered. They carried ledgers in lacquered boxes filled with names and numbers and codes. They always smiled, but not in a way that made children feel safe. They asked for tea, for a seat, for a chance to talk. But what they wanted was always the same. They wanted to see the boys. It started with compliments. How graceful he looks. How clever his eyes are. What fine posture. They asked about birthdays and illnesses, about schoolwork and appetite. It felt like a conversation, but it was an assessment. Every answer was noted. The way the boy sat, the way he responded when asked to stand, to turn, to walk, these were signals. The man was not alone. Sometimes he brought an assistant, sometimes a healer, sometimes a musician to test a boy's pitch or rhythm. They asked him to sing, to recite, to bow. The parents, embarrassed but hopeful, stood to the side, whispering to each other. When the child was ushered out of the room, the tone changed. The man opened his box. Silver coins, folded contracts. The offer was presented with rehearsed delicacy, as though they were discussing livestock, not their own son. He never pressured. He simply waited. Hunger did the rest. Once the contract was signed, things moved quickly. The boy was told to pack what little he had. Often, he didn't understand what was happening until the cart had already started rolling. He might wave back at the house, expecting to return by evening. But there would be no return. The collectors worked on strict timelines. Every season had its quota, and every boy had a destination. Some were taken to cities directly. Others were sent to training houses where their transformation would begin. The collectors received payment in advance or by delivery, depending on the reputation of the buyer. A well-known scout could command higher prices, and those who consistently delivered refined stock were rewarded handsomely. There were even competitions among them, who could find the rarest beauty, the youngest prodigy, the boy with the longest eyelashes, or the most lyrical voice. Some kept journals filled with sketches and notes, as if they were artists or botanists, not traffickers. Over time, the presence of these men became strangely accepted. Villagers who had once whispered about them in fear began preparing for their visits. Mothers taught their sons how to speak more clearly, how to walk gracefully, how to fold their hands just so. Fathers spoke of duty, of sacrifice, of how one child's departure could save the rest. The men who arrived with ledgers were no longer strangers. They were opportunities. Doors opened more quickly. Offers were made more freely. And still, no one said aloud what everyone understood. These weren't adoptions. They weren't apprenticeships. They were transactions. And the men who facilitated them never called themselves merchants. They preferred another word. They said they were helping. Helping families survive. Helping boys find a future. Helping the wealthy maintain the quiet perfection of their homes. But in truth, they were just teeth, sharp, polished, and always hungry. The selection process began long before a boy reached the palace or the manor. It began in the dust of a village courtyard, or in the shaded room of a local inn where the collectors arranged their evaluations. The boy would be asked to stand, usually barefoot, with arms slightly away from the sides and eyes straight ahead. He was told not to fidget, not to speak unless addressed, and most importantly, not to cry. Then came the circle. Men walked around him slowly, sometimes with folded hands, sometimes with a brush to lift his chin or adjust a sleeve. They examined him without urgency, as if appraising an object that might be expensive but not yet proven. They noted posture, weight distribution, the way the chest rose and fell. A boy who breathed too heavily was thought to be weak. One who stood too stiffly might be punished for pride. It wasn't a test. It was exposure. Flesh was next. Hands were taken and turned palm up, then down. Fingers were extended and inspected for symmetry, cleanliness, proportion. Nails were examined for color and shape. Calluses were frowned upon, as was any sign of labor. Feet were checked for flatness, heels for cracking, knees for bruises. The boy was asked to roll his shoulders, bend his spine, extend his arms. Back muscles were watched closely, not for strength, but for grace. They wanted flexibility without strain, movement without noise. The neck was tested for poise. Some inspectors placed a book on the boy's head to observe how he walked without letting it fall. Then came the face. Cheeks were pressed lightly, eyelids lifted. The jaw turned side to side. One man would stand close, face to face, watching for any twitch of resistance. Teeth were shown next, whether the boy wanted to or not. The lips were pulled back, the mouth opened, the gums checked for signs of illness. A healthy bite, unbroken enamel, no discoloration. These things mattered more than anyone admitted. Eyes were the final test. They had to be clear, bright, slightly wide set if possible. The sclera, the white, was checked for signs of sleep or sadness. Pupils were observed in different lighting. Some buyers preferred large eyes that looked upward naturally. Others liked eyes that tilted downward at the corners, giving an impression of shyness. But all agreed that the gaze must be soft. Not dull, not fearful. Soft. It was a delicate balance. Too bold, and the boy might be seen as insolent. Too evasive, and he might be labeled broken. The ideal expression was one of calm attentiveness. Present, but quiet. Beautiful, but passive. Inspectors developed their own methods for testing this. Some dropped a small object to see if the boy flinched. Others asked a simple question to observe his reaction time. Some even held silence, waiting to see whether the boy filled it or endured it. That, too, was a signal. The entire process rarely took more than an hour, but it left a mark that lasted far longer. Boys who passed were marked, sometimes literally, with ink or thread tied to the wrist. Those who failed were dismissed politely, returned to their families with a smile that didn't reach the eyes. But even they carried something back with them, the knowledge of what had been measured, what had been found wanting. The ones who passed were loaded into carts, dressed in finer clothes and told to sit straight. They didn't know where they were going. They weren't supposed to ask. The men in charge spoke in low voices and wrote in ledgers, already planning the next stop, the next selection. And behind them, the village closed its door, quietly erased the memory, and waited for the next time the men would come. The system didn't require force, it required repetition. And it worked, because everyone understood what was expected, even the boys. The contract was always presented with care, folded neatly, tucked into lacquered boxes, written in brushstrokes so elegant that even if someone could read, they might hesitate to ask questions. It was written in formal language, legal, ceremonial, intentionally vague. There were phrases about service, about education, about opportunity. It promised provisions, housing, protection. There were no direct references to what the boy would do, or what would be done to him. That part was left to implication, hidden behind euphemism and custom. The collectors read it aloud in calm voices, skipping over the denser passages, reassuring the parents with smiles and practiced words. They spoke of futures, of better lives, of how many families had already chosen this path. And the parents, most of whom could not read more than a name, nodded along, afraid to seem ungrateful or foolish. The coins were placed gently on the table, like an offering. Not too much, just enough to seem merciful. There was no lawyer, no witness, no translator. Only a brush, an inkstone, and the weight of desperation. Fathers signed with trembling hands. Mothers pressed their thumbprints beneath their husbands' names, holding their sons by the shoulders, telling them to be brave, to do their best. Some boys signed their own names, if they were old enough. Others simply watched, quiet and confused, as strangers wrote their fate in black ink. The paper was folded again, stored away, and never returned. No copies were given, no dates were confirmed. The family was told they might receive letters, news, even money someday, but few ever did. Once the document was signed, the process moved quickly. The boy was taken, gently, usually, and the collector departed before second thoughts could form. The silver was left behind, counted and recounted, stared at with a mixture of guilt and relief. It was always spent within days. No one asked what would happen if the boy ran away, or if he became sick, or if the household changed masters. The contract did not cover those things. It only recorded the transaction. A name, an age, a village, a price. It existed to prove that the trade was complete and that no one had been stolen. The collectors preferred it this way. A clean ledger, an obedient family, no questions. And for the families, the details didn't matter anymore. They had done what they believed was necessary. They had saved the others. Sometimes the mother wept after the cart disappeared, but often she did not. Life returned too quickly. There was water to fetch, fields to tend, other children to feed. The silver helped, but not for long, and the memory of the signature faded faster than the sound of the boy's voice. It was easier that way. Some contracts lasted 10 years. Others were permanent. Few were ever fulfilled as written. There were stories of boys who escaped, who made lives elsewhere, who returned as men no one recognized. But more often, they vanished entirely. The contracts remained, tucked in drawers, passed between hands, shown to new buyers as proof of origin. They were traded like shares, sometimes with additional notes scribbled in the margins. Obedient, sings well, loses weight in winter. These documents outlived the boys they named. They moved across cities and provinces, clean and silent, never revealing what they had cost. For the families who signed them, there was no recourse, no appeals. The paper was proof, not protection. And in the end, it served only one purpose: to make everything look official, to make it seem like a choice had been made. The first thing they took was the name. It wasn't done with cruelty, nor with ceremony. It simply happened, quietly, as part of the process. The name the boy had spoken since childhood, the one whispered to him by his mother at night, was deemed too plain, too local, too tied to a place that no longer claimed him. In its place, a new name was given. Something soft, something poetic, chosen not to reflect who he was, but how he was meant to be seen. Names like Autumn Light, Silver Reed, Little Plum, or Quiet Wind. Words meant to soothe the tongue and suggest elegance. Names that could belong to anyone, or to no one at all. The boy was told to answer to it immediately, to stop using the old name even in thought. It was not a suggestion. It was part of his transformation. A signal that he was no longer who he had been, and that the past no longer mattered. Next came the hair. In many villages, a boy's hair was a point of pride. Oiled and combed, tied back on festival days, grown long to show care and health. But here, in the training houses or receiving rooms of the estate, it was a problem. The past clung to it, so it was shaved away, not in violence but with methodical precision. Warm water, a cloth, a blade. No mirror. The first cut always drew silence. Some boys cried. Most didn't. Not because they weren't afraid, but because by then they had learned not to show it. The smooth scalp left behind was cleaned and perfumed, rubbed with herbs to soothe irritation. They were told it would grow back in time, shaped and arranged according to their master's preference. But in that moment, they stood bald and exposed, unfamiliar even to themselves. The mirror was returned only afterward, and even then, only briefly. Then came the clothing. Not fabric for warmth or protection, but for presentation. The silks were folded on low tables, waiting to be assigned. They were not chosen by the boys, but assigned to them like roles in a play. Light pastels for youthfulness, deep blues or violets for those with darker skin, bright reds for special occasions. Every color meant something. Every thread had intention. The robes were light but layered, making movement seem slower, more deliberate. The sashes were long, tied not for utility but effect. Sleeves often extended past the hands, hiding any nervous movement. Slippers were soft, designed to quiet footsteps. Even underclothes were embroidered with care, though no one was meant to see them. To wear these garments was to inhabit a fiction, one where the boy was not a person, but a reflection of someone else's desire. He was told to stand straighter, to walk more slowly, to look downward at the right moments. The clothing wasn't just beautiful, it was instructional. What emerged at the end of this process was not the same boy who had arrived. The transformation was not immediate, but it was visible. A child with a name and a voice had become something else, something framed and softened, designed and arranged. The new name, the shaved head, the silks that belonged to someone else's imagination, all of it worked together to erase what had come before. No one asked where the boy had been born. No one wanted to know what games he'd played, what songs his mother used to hum, what stories he whispered to himself at night. Those details were gone, like hair on the floor, swept away before anyone noticed. In their place was quiet wind, or autumn light, an image without history, a body without claim. And if he missed his name, if he whispered it to himself in the dark, there was no one left to answer to it. but silence. The training began early each morning, before the sun had fully risen, when the air was still cool and the house quiet. The boys were woken gently, then led to wash in silence. Their schedules were carved into the hours with no room for rest or resistance. First came posture, how to stand, how to kneel, how to bow without looking down too much or too little. Every gesture was rehearsed until it stopped looking like movement and became reflex. Then came voice work, recitation of poems. First, the tone poems of the Tang dynasty, then longer verses of sorrow or celebration. It didn't matter if the boys understood them. What mattered was rhythm, clarity, control. Their voices had to be musical, but never loud, expressive, but never too personal. They practiced calligraphy for hours, fingers aching as they copied the same characters over and over. Balance, grace, discipline. These were the only values repeated aloud. After writing came music, guqin, pipa, bamboo flute, depending on the house's preferences. Boys were taught scales first, then court pieces, then improvisations with strict boundaries. The music was not for their pleasure. It was for the pleasure of the listener. They were taught to respond to the mood of a room, to play louder or softer depending on who entered. A missed note meant repetition. Repetition meant hours. Some boys practiced with bleeding fingers, too afraid to ask for a bandage. Between lessons, there were sessions in massage and personal service. They learned how to read a master's mood by the way he sat, the way he spoke, the way he entered a room. They were drilled in the art of touch, where to apply pressure, how to soothe, when to speak, and when to vanish. None of this was discussed in cruel terms. It was presented as refinement, as preparation. But the boys understood what it was: performance under threat. Mistakes were not punished loudly. There were no screams, no public scoldings. Discipline here was quiet and methodical. A boy who hesitated during a poem might be denied food. A wrong tone in a song might mean standing through the night without sleep. Some were made to kneel on coarse tiles until their knees bruised and bled. Others were locked in small rooms until they learned silence. The worst punishments were not physical. They came in the form of removal, being passed over, ignored, erased from view. A boy who disappointed too many times might simply disappear from the house one day with no explanation. The others learned quickly not to ask where he had gone. The absence was answer enough. The message was clear. To remain visible, you had to become invisible. To survive, you had to be perfect. Not just obedient, but anticipatory. Not just beautiful, but effortless. It was not education. It was erosion. Over time, the boys began to change. They stopped flinching at correction. They spoke more slowly. They forgot what their real handwriting looked like. They stood in mirrors adjusting robes and facial expressions as if adjusting someone else's reflection. They could play a melody while thinking of nothing. They could smile while their hands trembled. Those who adapted quickly were praised, occasionally rewarded. A warm meal, softer shoes, an extra hour of rest. But praise was rare. Expectations were high and always rising. There was no completion, no graduation, only endurance. The training never truly ended. Even when the boy was deemed ready to be presented, the lessons continued in private. Always another song to memorize, another way to sit, another set of gestures to absorb. The process was not just about skill. It was about reshaping a person from the inside out until what remained was no longer a child, but something closer to sculpture, something that could be placed on display and trusted not to move. The room was never what the boy expected. It wasn't grand or loud or filled with guests. It was quiet. too quiet. Polished floors, filtered light, incense rising from a brass burner in the corner. He stood at the edge, back straight, palms pressed to the sides of his robes. He had been prepared for this moment with weeks of repetition. How to bow, how to speak if spoken to, how not to shift his weight or look uncertain. But now that it was happening, none of that felt real. The silence pressed against his ribs. Somewhere behind the screen, the master sat. He was not introduced. There was no name spoken, just the gentle rustle of fabric, the sound of tea being poured, the unmistakable presence of someone observing him too closely and not closely enough. The boy was called forward with a simple gesture he had been told to anticipate. He stepped across the floor slowly, feeling each footfall like a weight he didn't know he was carrying. When he stopped, he bowed. Not too deeply, not too quickly. His eyes remained lowered, as instructed. He waited for permission to rise, though it didn't come in words. There was a long pause, the kind that makes time feel warped. He could feel the man's gaze moving across him, from face to hands, shoulders to waist, stopping in places that made his breath feel foreign. It wasn't a look of curiosity. It was ownership, appraisal, a silent calculation of worth. The boy knew he was not being seen as a person. Not anymore, not even as a student or a servant. What stood before the master was the finished product of someone else's design, a soft voice, a poised posture, a face carefully trained not to betray fear. And yet inside, the boy felt himself slipping, not from nerves, but from distance, like watching something happen through water. He didn't blink, he didn't speak, he simply stood, waiting for the next gesture. The questions, when they came, were not about him, not truly. They were about performance. What poems had he learned? What instruments could he play? Could he sing? Dance? Had he been trained in serving wine? The boy answered as taught, short, respectful phrases with a voice just loud enough to be heard. Each response led to a new request. Play something. Recite something. Pour a cup. The master did not react. He gave no praise, no disapproval. He simply watched, occasionally nodding or lifting a finger to indicate the next task. For the boy, each movement felt like walking a tightrope he couldn't see. Every syllable, every step had weight, not because of what it meant, but because of what might happen if it failed to please. And yet, there was no visible threat, no raised voice, no looming consequence. Only that silence, only that gaze, fixed and quiet and impossibly heavy. When it ended without acknowledgement. A nod, a wave, a servant stepping forward to guide the boy out of the room. The door closed behind him as softly as it had opened. No words were spoken, no expression changed. But something had. The boy felt it immediately in the way the others looked at him, or didn't, in the way the house shifted around him. From that moment forward, he belonged. Not in the way a child belongs to a family, not even in the way a servant belongs to a household. He belonged like a vase, or a painting, or a song someone liked once and might grow tired of later. He had been seen, assessed, accepted. For now, it wasn't pride he felt. It wasn't relief. It was the slow, deep certainty that whatever he had once been, whoever had once called his name, was gone, left behind in the space between two breaths, and replaced by silence. The room was beautiful. That much couldn't be denied. Silk panels covered the walls, painted with birds and flowers that never moved but always watched. The floor was warm underfoot, polished wood set with rugs too fine to be walked on in shoes. There was a canopy bed, low and wide, draped in gauze that filtered the morning light into soft color. A lacquered screen offered privacy for dressing. A ceramic basin stood beside a small table where tea was left each morning, fresh and fragrant. Everything was clean, arranged, perfect. The cushions never lost their shape. The air smelled of jasmine or sandalwood, depending on the season. There were combs carved from bone, oils in tiny bottles, robes in muted pastels folded with care. A stranger might call it peaceful. A guest might even call it paradise. But the boy who lived there knew better. He knew what was behind the walls. More importantly, he knew what was behind the door. It didn't lock with a clang. There was no heavy bar or iron bolt, just a soft click from the outside, like the settling of a lid. Each morning, a servant entered to deliver the schedule, the food, the garments. Each night, the same servant returned to extinguish the candles, collect the tray, and pull the door closed. The boy heard the sound every evening, the subtle shift of wood, the metal catch sliding into place. It was not shouted. It was not hidden. It was simply done. As routine as the lighting of incense. The door had no handle on the inside, just smooth wood, polished and seamless. If he pressed his palm to it, he could feel the faint warmth from the other side. But it would not open. That knowledge lived in the back of his throat, behind his careful posture and controlled expressions. It lived in his breath, which he learned to hold every time footsteps passed in the hallway. The beauty of the room only made the silence worse. He was allowed to speak, of course, but only to those assigned to hear him. The attendants, the tutors, the master if summoned. But none of them lingered. The others in the house rarely visited. The boy's world was made of walls and softness, and time that folded into itself. He could watch the birds on the painted panels and imagine seasons passing outside. He could stare through the barred window and see nothing but sky, blue and unreachable. Sometimes he paced, though not often. The floor creaked slightly in one corner, and he came to avoid it. He read, he practiced, he waited. Even his movements became quiet, more out of habit than instruction. He spoke to himself only in whispers. He learned not to expect echoes. In a place so carefully arranged, noise felt like a mistake. And mistakes had consequences, even if they were never named. At night, the silence changed. It deepened. The wind outside sounded like footsteps. The flickering of the lantern cast shadows that moved just enough to make him pause. He lay on the bed, listening, to nothing, to everything. Sometimes he dreamt of open doors and forgot they weren't real. Sometimes he woke thinking he had heard someone call his name, only to remember he no longer had one that belonged to him. He didn't cry often. There was no point. Tears here were just another kind of silence. The room accepted them without resistance. The walls did not comfort. The beauty did not speak. And every morning, when the door clicked open again, he rose without comment, adjusted his robes, and prepared for another day. He did not try to leave. He did not ask to go outside, not because he was content, but because he knew. The door would only ever open for someone else, and always, always from the outside. He played the guqin with fingers trained to float, not strike. Each note had to feel effortless, as if it had risen from the strings on its own, without pressure, without labor. His posture was precise. Spine straight, shoulders low, sleeves tucked just so to reveal the quiet elegance of movement. The melodies were chosen in advance, sometimes by the master, sometimes by the tutor, and sometimes based on the weather. Lively on spring mornings, slow and mournful during rain. The songs were never his to choose. They belonged to the room, to the air, to whoever might be listening. And there was always someone listening, even if they said nothing. Sometimes the boy played for an hour, sometimes for 10 minutes, depending on the mood behind the screen. Applause was rare, comments even rarer. But silence, when it lingered, meant approval. That was how he learned to measure success, not in praise, but in the absence of correction. After music came poetry. He recited from the memory, long verses filled with metaphors he only partly understood. Love, sorrow, exile, longing, emotions that belonged to other people, other lifetimes. His voice had been trained for this, soft, steady, melodic, never too loud, never dramatic. The goal was not expression, but precision. He practiced for hours to eliminate tremble, to land each syllable exactly where it was supposed to fall. The same lines were repeated endlessly, not to understand them, but to perfect the sound. Calligraphy came next. Each character had to match the rhythm of the voice. A poem written poorly was a blemish. A poem written beautifully was just another offering. Beauty was never the end in itself. It was a function, a service. His hands moved through ink the same way they moved through string and tone, carefully, invisibly, with no intention except to please. There were other lessons: tea ceremonies, flower arrangement, the art of conversation without speaking too much. Everything pointed in one direction: to become a reflection. A presence that could comfort without speaking, entertain without drawing attention, impress without seeming to try. The boy was not expected to be brilliant. He was expected to be flawless. His voice was meant to blend into the air, his words to echo thoughts that were not his own. Guests sometimes visited, noblemen or officials, and the boy would be summoned to recite, to play, to serve. He bowed, smiled, performed. Eyes followed him, but never met his directly. Compliments were exchanged, not with him, but about him, as if he were not in the room. He learned to stand very still after he finished, to await dismissal or further instruction. He never left first. And so the arts became something else entirely. Not a means of expression, not a celebration of self, but a kind of quiet currency. Every note, every brushstroke, every turn of phrase was another step in preserving his place. The boy came to understand that beauty was not something he owned, but something he owed. His voice was not his. His hands were not his. His thoughts had no place here. The poetry he spoke belonged to someone long dead. The music he played belonged to a mood he was not allowed to feel. And still, he played. Still, he recited. Because that was the point. The silence after a successful performance lasted longer than the silence before. It was a different kind of quiet. Deeper, colder, full of unspoken permission. And in that quiet, he could rest, not because he was satisfied, but because for a while he was safe. His day began not with food, but with reflection, quite literally. The mirror stood in the corner, framed in lacquer and taller than the boy himself. Each morning he faced it in silence, sleeves rolled back, eyes half lowered as attendants examined the overnight damage. Any swelling, any redness, any trace of blemish was recorded and addressed. His skin was cleaned with infusions of rice water and lotus. Cloths soaked in cooled tea were pressed to his face to tighten and tone. Paste made from crushed pearl was rubbed into his cheeks until the skin grew thin and tender. He was taught how to hold his chin, how to breathe through his nose, how to blink slowly. His eyebrows were trimmed, not plucked, unless they grew uneven. His lips were rubbed with slices of fruit, his fingertips polished, his ears cleaned daily. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing was left to nature. Body maintenance was a ritual that consumed hours. Herbal steams opened his pores, cold rinses closed them again. Mists made from crushed leaves were sprayed along his arms and neck to create a soft, floral scent that never clashed with the master's surroundings. He was weighed weekly, measured monthly. Weight loss was met with silence. Weight gain, however small, brought shame. Meals were portioned precisely. Bowls of millet, slices of steamed pear, nothing fried, nothing salted. Hunger became a permanent sensation, more familiar than sleep. Some boys whispered tricks to each other, how to sip water with vinegar to dull cravings, how to clench the jaw until the pangs passed. Others learned to chew slowly, painfully slowly, to make a handful of rice last 20 minutes. His body was not his own. It was sculpture under constant adjustment, and food was not nourishment, it was risk. Even rest became performance. He was taught to sleep on his back, head slightly elevated to avoid lines on the face. Blankets were thin to prevent overheating. He was warned not to toss, not to turn, not to cry in his sleep. In the mornings he often woke sore, with limbs stiff from staying still too long. But if the skin looked good, if the eyes were clear, it was worth it. Blemishes were treated with boiled roots and sour oils that burned against the skin. Bruises were covered with tinted powders. Cuts from razors or trimming blades were kept secret. Sometimes a boy would injure himself accidentally during practice. A fall, a slip, and he would hide it, smiling through the pain, until the swelling gave him away. There was no comfort in the healing process, no soothing hand, no voice saying, "It's all right." Just the expectation to look undamaged, no matter the cost. And always, the mirror. It became a presence in the room, not a tool, but a judge. He learned to study himself as others would, from angles, in motion, under different light. He memorized his best expressions, how to smile with just the eyes, how to lower his gaze without seeming afraid. He stood for long minutes adjusting the lay of his robe, the fall of his hair, the placement of his hands. He practiced stillness, posture, elegance. Sometimes he barely recognized the face looking back at him, not because it had changed, but because it no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the role, to the room, to whoever might be watching. And in that quiet preparation, he found no joy, only the dull ache of maintenance and the unspoken truth that beauty was a duty, one that could never be completed, only preserved until it broke. There were others, always. In the beginning, it was easy to pretend otherwise. The boys rarely saw one another during the day. Their schedules were staggered, their lessons divided, their rooms spread across the estate like separate worlds. But at meal times or during preparation for events, they passed each other in silence, eyes glancing, not meeting. Each face became a measure. Who had grown thinner? Whose skin looked clearer? Who had been summoned more often that week? They didn't speak of it, no one needed to. The hierarchy was unspoken but deeply felt. It shifted constantly, like dust in sunlight. But everyone knew who stood higher and who had begun to fall. A word from a master, a glance held too long, a gift placed discreetly in someone's room. These were signals. They moved like scent through the halls, invisible but undeniable. And once a boy noticed them, he could no longer unsee the shape of the ladder he'd been placed upon. There were no rules to the competition. Nothing was announced, nothing posted or declared. But every action mattered. How one carried a tray, how quickly one responded to a summons, how elegantly one bowed. If one boy faltered in song and another performed flawlessly the next day, the difference stayed in the air. If one looked tired and another glowed with alertness, it was noted. The masters rarely spoke of comparison aloud, but the environment itself did the work. A gift offered to one and not another. A longer visit. A smile. The smallest gestures acquired weight. And the boys, no matter how young, learned to calculate. They noticed which tones of robe drew the most compliments. They memorized which poems seemed to quiet the room. They studied each other with the same intensity used to study themselves, always looking for an advantage. Not out of cruelty, but survival. Friendship was dangerous. It made you vulnerable. A shared secret could become a weapon. A whispered complaint could be repeated. Even kindness was suspect. If a boy helped another fix his hair, it might be seen as weakness, or worse, as collusion. And if the helper received praise later that day, suspicion bloomed. No one said it, but everyone knew. Someone had to fall for another to rise. That knowledge settled like a weight in the chest. It wasn't hatred that grew between them. It was distance, a deliberate coolness. They could share space, share silence, even share tears in rare moments of exhaustion. But they did not share trust. Even those who had entered the house together, boys who once walked the same village path or drank from the same stream, found themselves on opposite sides of an invisible boundary. The place did not allow closeness. It offered attention, and attention demanded isolation. Over time, the competition became internalized. The boys woke each day not just to meet expectations, but to exceed the version of themselves they imagined others saw. They practiced longer, even when no one was watching. They studied their own faces for flaws only rivals might notice. They smiled when they were afraid, laughed when they were exhausted, praised others with words that hid resentment. The house did not need to divide them. It only needed to reward one slightly more than the others. That was enough. The rest happened naturally. They learned to walk quietly past each other in the corridors, to sleep lightly in case footsteps paused outside their door, to fear both silence and attention. There were no outbursts, no arguments, just a slow, steady pressure that shaped them into softer versions of themselves, pliable, polite, and alone. Not because they wanted to be, but because in a place where beauty meant value and value meant survival, there was no room left for anyone else. Meals arrived like everything else in the house, quietly, on schedule, without explanation. Each dish was placed on lacquered trays by attendants who said nothing, their hands practiced and precise. The portions were small, artfully arranged, lightly seasoned, often warm, but never steaming. A bowl of congee, a few slices of pear, a spoonful of pickled greens. Occasionally a strip of fish or a cube of tofu. Every plate was curated not for nutrition, but for effect. Too much salt would cause puffiness, too much oil would show on the skin. The goal was balance, enough to preserve a delicate glow, never enough to slow the body or dull the eyes. For the boys, hunger was a constant companion, not sharp or painful, but dull and humming, like a thread pulled too tight. It made them lighter on their feet, quieter in their movements. It reminded them to stay graceful. But food was more than maintenance. It was measurement. A sweet dumpling might appear at the edge of a tray after a performance. A bowl of warm soup might follow a morning when the boy was praised. These small additions were never acknowledged. No one said, "You did well today." The reward simply appeared, gleaming under the lantern light, its presence more powerful than any spoken approval. It meant someone had noticed. It meant someone had decided he was worth the indulgence. The boys came to recognize the patterns. One extra grape, a square of honeyed rice, a second bowl of broth. They adjusted themselves accordingly, smiling more during songs, keeping their posture still for longer, lowering their eyes just enough to appear both grateful and modest. They learned how to make their hunger work for them, how to turn a craving into a performance. Wanting was never enough. You had to earn it, delicately, invisibly. And just as food could reward, it could also vanish. A crooked bow, a flat tone, a misplaced word, and the tray arrived lighter, or later, or not at all. A missed meal was not announced. It was simply absence, made louder by the silence that followed. The boy would sit in his room as evening fell, listening to footsteps pass by, to doors open and close, to the clink of bowls being set down elsewhere. He would fold his hands and wait, even though he knew no one was coming. The emptiness in his stomach grew heavier than any punishment. The next day he moved more carefully, spoke more softly, forced a smile when his throat felt dry. He could not ask for food. To ask was to admit failure. The only path forward was to correct himself, to refine the angles of his face, the rhythm of his voice, until the sweetness returned to the tray. Over time, eating became performance too. The boys learned not to finish too quickly, not to show too much pleasure. To eat too slowly was vanity. To eat too eagerly was desperation. The perfect meal was eaten with quiet grace, each bite measured, each sip composed. They kept their backs straight, their sleeves folded, their eyes lowered. They chewed with intention, as if the food itself were part of the act. And in a way it was. In that house, food was never just food. It was a signal, a reflection of status, a mirror held up not to the body, but to the soul, or at least to the version of it others wished to see. A boy who received a sugared plum was envied. A boy who missed dinner was pitied in silence. No one spoke of hunger, not openly. But every boy knew its shape. Every boy had felt the sting of an empty tray. And every boy had learned, eventually, how to smile just right to make it return. The face was only the beginning. What lay beneath the silk had to be just as carefully managed, just as curated. Weight was recorded weekly on carved wooden scales, the kind used for measuring fine tea or coinage. The boys stepped onto them in silence, sleeves held aside, eyes forward. No comment was made in the moment, just a small nod, a mark in a book, a glance exchanged between attendants. Later, the results would ripple through the day. A smaller portion at lunch, a whispered warning during robe fitting, an unexpected punishment wrapped in politeness. A gain of even half a catty could bring consequences. A loss might bring concern, but only if it affected appearance. The goal was not health. It was balance. The body needed to appear light, graceful, effortless, as if it had been shaped by the air, not by hunger and discipline. Skin was observed like a map. Every patch, every blemish, every shadow under the eyes was catalogued and addressed. Lotions made from herbs and crushed pearl were rubbed into the arms and neck. Baths were taken in specially prepared infusions, lotus root, chrysanthemum, mint leaves. The water was warm, but never too hot. It couldn't flush the skin or redden it. After bathing, the boys stood before mirrors or tutors, who examined them under lantern light. Backs were checked for marks, shoulders for posture, elbows for dryness. If something was wrong, it wasn't discussed. It was corrected. Roughness meant more exfoliation. Puffiness meant less salt. Dryness meant different oils, different powders, different rest. The boys came to know their bodies not as vessels, but as surfaces. They treated their skin like paper, delicate, smooth, meant to be touched only gently and only by approval. Posture was a form of control all its own. They practiced sitting until their spines felt carved from stone, walked with books on their heads for balance, and stood for hours without shifting weight from one foot to the other. They were corrected constantly, shoulders too high, neck too low, hands held too tightly. Even the way they breathed was adjusted. Slow, shallow, never enough to move the chest noticeably. They learned to carry stillness like clothing. The ideal body moved only when asked, flowed only when observed, and returned to stillness the moment the gaze passed. The most prized boys were those who looked as though they had been painted into the room, present but untouchable, alive but undemanding. To move without effort, to hold shape without strain. That was the illusion they trained for, day after day, under the eyes of tutors who never smiled and never explained why. What all of this created was not just beauty, but submission. The body, shaped so carefully, became a symbol of compliance. There was no strength in the limbs that wasn't meant for dance. No weight gained that wasn't subject to suspicion. Even the hands, soft, slender, never calloused, existed only to serve. The boy was not meant to occupy his own body with comfort or pride. He was meant to disappear into it, to become invisible behind its perfection. Any sign of resistance, flesh, bone, breath, was something to be filed down, rubbed away, hidden. And so the body became a cage that looked like art, a machine made of grace and restraint. It stood straight, moved softly, looked flawless. But inside, the will was quieted, dulled, folded into obedience. Not because the boy wanted it that way, but because he had learned over time that anything else would be punished, or worse, noticed. Illness was not forbidden, but it was unwelcome, treated less as misfortune and more as failure. A cough meant lost beauty. A fever meant blemished skin. Anything that disrupted the illusion of elegance was a liability, and liabilities had short lives in houses that prized perfection. The boys learned quickly to hide their discomfort. A sore throat was masked with warm tea and silence. A dizzy spell became an accidental slip. If they collapsed during practice, they apologized before they could be scolded. Tutors frowned at weakness. Attendants looked away. There were no physicians assigned to care for them individually, only household healers whose main task was to maintain appearance, not restore health. Herbal compresses were applied to bruises. Cooling powders were given for swelling. But true treatment, the kind meant to cure, was rare. More often, symptoms were suppressed just long enough to allow the boy to continue performing, regardless of what his body endured. The fear of being seen as sick ran deeper than the pain itself. A boy who showed signs of illness risked being replaced, reassigned, or simply removed. No explanation was needed. His room would be empty one morning, his name no longer spoken, his belongings quietly collected by someone else. The others understood what that meant. They learned not to ask. Instead, they whispered advice when no one was listening. How to stay upright when fever blurred your vision, how to disguise weight loss by layering your robes, how to color your lips with crushed fruit to hide the gray. The body became a puzzle to be managed, an enemy as much as a vessel. Even the strongest among them knew how quickly one cold breeze, one missed meal, one unguarded moment could change everything. And once a master lost interest, once a boy was seen as fragile, no amount of performance could undo it. Injuries were more complicated. A burn from incense, a twisted ankle during a dance, a finger caught in a folding screen. These things happened, and when they did, the boy was expected to recover quickly and quietly. He was given ointments, sometimes wrapped in bandages laced with bitter root, but never rested for long. Rest suggested indulgence. Rest meant others had to take his place, and that balance, already so fragile, might shift without him. So he limped through lessons, sang with cracked voices, bowed while hiding winces. The pain was compartmentalized, stored somewhere behind the practiced smile and fluid gestures. No one wanted to see it. No one wanted to know. The very structure of the household depended on the illusion of seamlessness. Even suffering had to be invisible, especially suffering, because once it was noticed, it became someone else's burden, and burdens in such places were never carried for long. When death came, it did so quietly. There were no mourning rituals, no public farewells. A boy who slipped too far into illness might be taken away at night, while the others slept. His bed would be empty by morning, the sheets replaced, the scent erased. Sometimes another would arrive to fill the space. Sometimes not. But always the absence was noted only in silence. Those who remained didn't dare speak of him, not even in whispers. They lit their incense, folded their robes, adjusted their posture. They ate what they were given and stood when they were called. The body had failed, they told themselves. That was all. And so they looked after their own with even greater vigilance, watching for spots, counting heartbeats, measuring breath. Because in that world, to be beautiful was not enough. One had to appear invulnerable. And if the cost of that illusion was quiet suffering, then so be it. It was better than the alternative, being forgotten before the bed had cooled. It always began the same way. A new arrival. A boy no older than the others had once been, quiet-eyed, soft-voiced, dressed in the same pale silks that smelled faintly of starch and travel. He was introduced to no one. He was simply there one morning, standing at the far end of the courtyard during music practice, or seated silently during a meal, mimicking the motions he had not yet been taught. No announcement was made. No room was identified as newly vacated. But those who had been in the house long enough knew what his presence meant. Somewhere, not loudly and not recently, someone else had left, and not through the front gate. They had faded, like ink left in sunlight. Slowly, invisibly, until no one dared speak their name. The system didn't require ceremony. It required continuity. A face replaced a face. A voice replaced a voice. And the rhythm never paused. The changes were subtle at first. A shift in routine. A missed practice partner. A robe that no longer hung in its usual place. One boy, previously favored, now called less often. His tray arriving lighter, his presence increasingly optional. No one explained. The masters never gave reasons. But the signs were clear, and everyone knew how to read them. Falling out of favor didn't happen all at once. It happened like a door closing slowly behind you, each day a little less light, a little more silence. And when the time came, the departure would be quiet. The boy would be summoned unexpectedly, and the others would pretend not to notice. They'd continue their practice, recite their lines, play their music. By morning, the room would be clean. A new boy would sleep in the same bed, wear the same robes, smile the same rehearsed smile. And the cycle would begin again. Some of the boys tried to befriend the new ones, especially early on. They offered small comforts: how to fold a sash properly, which servant was kindest, how to mask fatigue without looking sullen. But even these gestures faded over time. The new arrivals were reminders, not of beginnings, but of endings. They carried with them the same soft fear that everyone else had learned to swallow. For every boy who entered, one would disappear. That was the unspoken rule, and while none of them said it aloud, they all felt it. Every compliment the newcomer received, every extra minute he spent in the presence of the master, was a shadow cast on someone else. And shadows lengthened quickly in places like this. You learned to watch them without turning your head, to smile when you felt cold, to speak gently when your throat ached. Because the only thing worse than being replaced was watching it happen to someone else and knowing you might be next. Over time, the arrivals stopped surprising anyone. The boys stopped asking where they came from, how they had gotten here, what their names had been before they were changed. It didn't matter. The system didn't allow for origin stories. It allowed for function. As long as there were buyers, there would be replacements. The house renewed itself with the same efficiency as a well-kept garden, pruning, trimming, replanting, always with an eye toward appearance. And like flowers, the boys were expected to bloom on cue, in silence, for as long as they were useful. No longer. The system did not need to punish those who aged or weakened. It simply moved on without them. A clean transition. A quiet trade. And by the time someone asked, "What happened to?" they had already forgotten how to finish the question. There was only the new boy now, the new smile, the new voice, and the same silence waiting behind it all. They crossed paths in quiet places, outer courtyards, shaded hallways, moonlit gardens where footsteps were muted by stone. The women of the household, whether wives or concubines, moved with the same studied grace the boys had been taught. Their eyes lingered, but not long. A glance. A flicker of recognition, sometimes nothing at all. There were rules between them, though no one had written them down. They weren't enemies, but they weren't allies either. They were simply two groups occupying different corners of the same delicate system, each defined by their silence, their performance, their place. The wives held legal standing, the concubines held fluctuating favor, and the boys, dressed in soft silks, trained to sing and serve, were something else entirely. Not rivals, not companions, just others, just shadows, too familiar to be ignored, too foreign to be embraced. Conversations, when they happened, were brief and heavily coded. A woman might ask if the boy was cold, or if the new scent in his robe was jasmine. She might compliment his hair, or his playing, or the way he poured tea. These weren't true questions. They were gestures. Openings, perhaps, or subtle warnings. The boy answered carefully, eyes lowered, voice smooth. He did not ask questions in return. He did not linger. The walls were too thin for gossip, too thick for trust. Rumors sometimes drifted between rooms, that a concubine had been replaced because of something whispered by a boy, or that a boy had been dismissed after offending the mistress of the house. No one confirmed these things. But the rumors were enough. They created space between people who already lived in different silences. Enough space to keep everyone cautious. Enough to keep them apart. Yet there were moments, brief, fragile moments when that space cracked. A shared look after a scolding. A hushed word offered behind a folding screen. An accidental brush of fingers as one passed the other a cup. Some women, especially those no longer favored, seemed to see the boys clearly, not as ornaments, but as something closer to what they themselves had once been. Chosen, shaped, then slowly forgotten. There was no comfort in the recognition, only a kind of dull sympathy. A nod that said, "Yes, I know." But even that couldn't last. Affection was dangerous. Attachment worse. If the master suspected any closeness, punishment followed. And so even kindness had to be brief. A smile that faded too slowly could become a threat. A favor repeated twice could become betrayal. In a house built on beauty, bonds were considered flaws in the design. So they drifted past each other, day after day, performing different versions of the same role. The women carried history, marriages arranged, children lost or expected, names with weight behind them. The boys carried silence. No lineage, no future. Just service. Just presence. And yet, beneath the layers of silk and ritual, there was a shared knowledge that neither was truly seen for who they were. They had been chosen for how they looked, how they moved, how well they filled the space they were given. And in that knowledge, there might have been a kind of closeness, if the system had allowed it. But it didn't. It demanded separation. It demanded performance. And so they remained, not as strangers, not as friends, but as mirrors, passing each other in quiet corridors, always aware, never connected, each one beautiful, each one alone. There's a story, whispered in the margins of court poetry and half-erased scrolls. It tells of an emperor, one of many, though which exactly is no longer clear, and the boy he favored above all others. The boy had skin like porcelain, and a voice that stilled whole chambers. They said he sang poems not as recitations, but as if the verses were being born on his tongue. The emperor gave him gifts, silks embroidered with gold thread, combs inlaid with jade, a private garden where plum blossoms fell like snow. At banquets, he sat near the throne. During the idle hours, he played the zither, while the emperor watched in silence. They were not equals. No one dared suggest they were. But for a time, they were close. So close that when the emperor once fell asleep beside the boy, he refused to wake him, even when protocol demanded he rise. Instead, he cut free the sleeve of his own robe so the boy could rest undisturbed. That gesture, the severed sleeve, became legend. A symbol of affection, yes, but also of surrender, of how power bends for beauty. And like most court legends, it became more than just a story. It became a metaphor. The passion of the sleeve, they called it, a phrase that echoed across generations. Poets used it when speaking of quiet devotion. Scholars used it to hint at forbidden desire. But courtiers, eunuchs, and the boys themselves understood its true meaning. It was a warning, because after the season of favor came silence. The boy, once elevated, disappeared. No record of his departure. No ceremony. Just gone. Another boy would take his place. And though the robe was replaced and the plum trees continued to bloom, something in the air shifted. The others, those still waiting, still performing, walked more carefully, smiled less. The lesson had been received. The emperor, of course, remained. So did the palace, the rituals, the songs. But the story lived on because everyone recognized the shape of it. Not just in that one court or that one dynasty, but in many. Power, when it turns toward affection, becomes dangerous, and affection, when it lingers too long, becomes a flaw. The tale of the sleeve was told in quiet corners, not just to entertain, but to instruct. This is how close is too close. This is what happens when beauty becomes too visible. It wasn't just about love. It was about the cost of being chosen, and the fragility of favor in a world where nothing personal stayed private for long. The boys who served in the shadow of that story learned to be graceful, not grateful. Present, not permanent. They learned that every gift could be revoked, and every gesture of kindness might carry a blade inside. Some claimed the story was embellished, that there had never been such a boy, or that the emperor's sleeve was cut for different reasons entirely. But those details didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the shape of the tale, the image of the robe, the sleeping boy, the silence that followed. That was the part that stayed. Because in a system built on performance, even love became a performance. And the cut sleeve, clean, poetic, tragic, was the perfect scene. It had all the right elements: devotion, sacrifice, disappearance. And above all, it was quiet. There was no rebellion in it, no disruption, just a soft ending, like a curtain falling. And that made it safe enough to survive. So the story was told again and again, not to remember the boy, but to remind those who came after him what beauty was worth and what it could cost. Underneath the golden eaves of the Forbidden City, politics did not always unfold in council chambers or on scrolls lined with official seals. Sometimes the empire's course was shaped in quieter places, behind lacquered screens, beneath silk covers, in rooms that opened only for a select few. Proximity to power was not just about lineage or military success. In certain moments, it was about who shared the emperor's pillow. In those intimate, heavily perfumed spaces, decisions were seeded, not shouted, not debated, but suggested, whispered, embedded in compliments, or left hanging like incense smoke in the morning light. It was understood among ministers and generals alike. The one who pleased the emperor last night might control appointments by noon, and the boys, beautiful, trained, disposable, became more than decoration. They became conduits, sometimes pawns, sometimes players. Not every boy sought influence, but many were taught how to wield it. Tutors didn't just train them in poetry and calligraphy. They taught timing, when to speak, when to laugh, when to look down. They learned the art of remembering names, of praising the right official, of echoing the emperor's doubts at precisely the right moment. One misplaced word could end a career. One carefully placed word could end someone else's. These boys, some barely in their teens, could sway appointments, cancel decrees, or redirect military campaigns simply by shifting the mood of the man beside them. Their presence in the inner chambers blurred the lines between affection and strategy. The emperor might not always know he was being nudged, but the court did. The court always knew. Rumors moved faster than edicts. Courtiers speculated not only about who was favored, but what that favor meant for the realm. If a border general was suddenly recalled, if a provincial tax code was amended, if a scholar found himself inexplicably promoted, it was often traced back to a name murmured behind a curtain, a boy glimpsed walking with a certain grace, carrying gifts that meant more than they appeared. The political implications of a shared bed were vast. Entire factions rose and fell on the strength of a glance, a rumor of a touch, a breakfast served late. And in the higher levels of bureaucracy, officials learned to pay attention to the boys, not just the emperor. Some even sent gifts, delicate fans, bracelets, poems scrawled in trembling brush strokes, not to curry affection, but to place a message where the emperor's eyes might fall during a moment of softness. But such power came at a cost. The boys were never safe. Their influence was conditional, their standing built on shifting sand. Jealous rivals waited for any sign of misstep. One accusation, true or false, could lead to exile or worse. And the emperor's own mood, as changeable as the northern wind, could sour without warning. A boy too clever might be labeled manipulative. too reserved, and he was forgettable. The balance between charm and caution became a daily struggle. There were no true victories, only extensions of survival. And yet, some thrived. They learned to turn their perceived fragility into a kind of armor, to place softness against strength, to move like shadows through the machinery of empire. Their voices never echoed in the imperial court, but their influence clung to the decisions made there. The phrase, "politics through pillows," was never spoken aloud, not in official records, but it was understood. It wasn't about romance. It wasn't about consent. It was about access. Who had it, how long they could hold it, and what they dared to do with it while it lasted. These boys, trained in obedience and grace, became temporary kings behind a throne they could never sit upon. Their touch shaped borders. Their presence redirected armies. And yet, when they were gone, they left no signature, only the faint ripple of consequences, like the echo of a whispered name in a room already swept clean. Under the surface of imperial rituals and diplomatic protocols, a quieter economy of favors and leverage flowed through the corridors of power. It was not recorded in ledgers, but it was deeply understood. To gain the emperor's favor, you had to offer something more delicate than silver, more captivating than jade. In certain periods of the Chinese dynasties, particularly when emperors grew known for their preferences, the offering of a beautiful boy became a silent currency. These boys did not arrive by accident. They were selected, groomed, and delivered by those seeking something in return: an official title, a tax exemption, a second chance. The practice wasn't merely tolerated. In some courts, it was expected. And those who anticipated the emperor's desires before he voiced them found their rewards swift and generous. Provincial governors were among the most frequent participants in this exchange. Managing vast regions, they understood that their continued power depended not only on efficient governance, but on imperial favor. When tribute time approached, some sent rare animals, fine textiles, or intricate calligraphy. But the more astute ones added something more personal. A boy, soft-featured and educated just enough to entertain without threatening. These offerings were framed as gestures of loyalty. The letters that accompanied them spoke of humble gifts to brighten the celestial mood. What remained unwritten was the calculation behind the gift. Who else had the emperor's ear? How many more voices could be silenced by one well-timed arrival? For the governors, it was strategy. For the boys, it was transportation into a life they did not choose. Surprisingly, or perhaps not, religious institutions also took part. Some Buddhist and Taoist monasteries, especially those reliant on elite patronage, became silent recruiters. Boys abandoned at temple doors were sometimes raised with a dual purpose: spiritual learning and aesthetic refinement. Not all of them were destined for enlightenment. A few, singled out for their beauty and demeanor, were discreetly transferred into courtly circles. The logic was unsettlingly pragmatic. A monastery that pleased a prince or emperor might receive protection, land, or influence. In those sacred spaces where devotion was preached, arrangements were made behind sliding doors, between abbots and envoys, always in the name of harmony, never openly acknowledged. It was not a system written in doctrine, but it was enforced with quiet efficiency. The boys, taught to bow both in prayer and in courtly ceremony, served more than one master. Merchants, too, found ways to participate, though their path was more precarious. They lacked titles and official roles, but wealth could still open doors. A particularly ambitious trader might fund a journey for a hand-picked boy, dressed him in expensive fabrics, and arranged for his introduction to a noble household, or even the palace itself. These gifts, too, were masked in politeness. a youth of remarkable talent, a performer of refined skill, a singer for the honored halls. But the intent was always the same: to gain access, to secure a contract, to protect a trade route. The boy, in these cases, was not only a symbol of luxury, but a living proposal, a promise that the merchant knew how to please power. Some succeeded and rose in social standing, others failed, and their gifts were discarded. The boys, in either case, were rarely consulted. All of this happened without official acknowledgement. No scroll declared the value of a human offering. No minister wrote down the rules of this unspoken market. And yet it persisted, quietly, ruthlessly. The court received its tributes. The empire ran. And behind the red lacquered walls, boys entered through side gates, their names forgotten, their senders rewarded. They were never allowed to speak of where they came from. Most wouldn't know how. But the governors climbed, the monasteries thrived, and the merchants shipped silks by the boatload. In this silent trade, nothing was sold. Everything was bought. In the stillness of ancient monasteries, nestled deep within mist-covered mountains, or hidden behind thick temple walls, the teachings of the Buddha echoed in chants and rituals. The path was supposed to lead away from desire, away from the self, away from suffering. Monks shaved their heads, donned simple robes, and took vows of celibacy and poverty. But beneath that serene surface, human weakness lingered, patient, practiced, and sometimes institutionalized. In some of these sacred spaces, particularly those with influence or wealth, a parallel system quietly grew, one that contradicted every principle it claimed to uphold, one that replaced renunciation with indulgence. There were no public confessions, no visible signs of decadence. But within select monasteries, beautiful boys served not just tea or incense. They were there to be seen, admired, and owned. It did not begin as corruption. It began as privilege. Wealthy patrons would donate land, gold, or grain to monasteries. In return, the abbots offered blessings, prayers, or private teachings. But over time, some patrons expected more personal rewards. The monks, eager to retain favor and funding, began grooming certain orphans or acolytes to entertain. At first, this meant music, poetry, or dance. All respectable, all cultural. But the attention these boys attracted was not innocent, and neither were the relationships that formed. The monasteries that embraced this unspoken exchange prospered. They expanded their halls, commissioned grand statues, and hosted powerful guests. The boys became fixtures, quiet, obedient, and always just out of reach of official scrutiny. They weren't students of the Dharma. They were instruments of gratitude. The contradiction was visible to everyone, and acknowledged by no one. Pilgrims bowed before statues of compassion while ignoring the silent figure trailing behind a high-ranking monk. The scriptures spoke of detachment, but some abbots hoarded silk robes and lacquered chests. Outsiders who asked too many questions were politely dismissed or warned away. And the boys, raised in silence, trained in grace, learned never to speak unless spoken to. They were given new names, sometimes names of flowers or stars, and their histories were erased as if they had never belonged to the world outside. Their beauty was a resource, and their purpose was to please. Not in public, never officially, but within certain rooms that locked from the inside, tradition and power blended into something neither holy nor entirely profane. Even within the hierarchy of monastic life, lines blurred. Some monks defended the practice by invoking metaphor, the boy as a mirror of the divine, the bond as a form of spiritual devotion. Others said nothing at all, treating it as inheritance, not invention. For the boys, there was no doctrine, only routine. Baths in cold stone basins, meals prepared with careful seasoning, hours spent practicing calligraphy or memorizing sutras, not for enlightenment, but to impress. Some aged out and were quietly dismissed or sent to distant temples. A few were absorbed into monastic ranks, their pasts unspoken. But most simply disappeared, from records, from memory, from the lives they might have had. The monastery walls stayed silent. The chants continued, and the world looked on in reverence. But deep within the stone corridors, where incense masked more than smoke, detachment had a different meaning. It meant being removed from the world not to find peace, but to serve without a name. They were never told when it would happen. No sign was given, no notice issued. One day the silk robe no longer arrived. The hair oil wasn't replenished. The morning meal became plainer, less fragrant. And then, as quietly as a lamp being snuffed out, they were no longer summoned. The corridors that once echoed with careful footsteps now passed them by. In the tightly wound hierarchy of the palace or the household, they had ceased to be part of the current. Once they were seated near the head of the table, never eating first, but always being seen. Now they sat closer to the kitchen, or not at all. They didn't fall from grace. They were simply no longer required. And that, in the system's logic, was enough. What happened next depended on where they lived and who had owned them. In some households, former favorites were given quiet work, serving tea, managing storerooms, keeping the accounts of other servants. It was not cruelty, exactly, but it was absence. The silks were replaced by cotton. The name that had once been murmured in poetry was now barked as a command. In wealthier homes, they might be moved to distant wings, placed under the care of older attendants, or sent away to a countryside estate. In more ruthless places, especially among aristocracy, they could vanish entirely. Not from violence necessarily, but from erasure. No more mentions, no more records, no more memory. Only the walls would remember, and even they would forget in time. Some tried to regain favor. They memorized new poems, practiced their lute behind closed doors, perfected the art of pouring wine with a bowed wrist. But those performances were shadows of what once had power. The smile that once captivated now looked tired. The face that once matched imperial aesthetics now bore the marks of age, of effort, of anxiety. And in a world where worth was measured not by loyalty or endurance, but by momentary charm, the outcome was inevitable. Others accepted the change in silence. They stopped waiting by doors. They watched the next generation arrive, fresher, younger, softer in voice and manner. The competition was never declared, but it was always present. And losing it meant fading, not in drama, but in dust. No ceremony marked their removal. No farewell was offered. In some texts, these boys are described as having returned to service, as if this were an honorable cycle. In truth, many lived out their days quietly, doing work that required no beauty, no presence, no name. Some were reassigned to temple grounds or minor government posts, not because of talent, but because of convenience. And some, especially in the highest circles, simply stopped appearing in the records. Perhaps they lived, perhaps they didn't. History didn't care to follow. Their purpose had been served, and in the eyes of the system, that was all they had been given. A purpose once. And now, only silence. By the time the mirrors had lost their clarity and the perfume jars stood half-used, something else had become part of their nightly routine. Not always spoken of, and rarely documented, opium drifted into the private quarters like incense. It was not administered as medicine, not officially, but it was always available, sometimes in the form of pipes, sometimes as a tincture. It dulled the edge of waiting. It softened the long silences between performances, visits, and approval. For boys trained to remain composed and luminous under the weight of constant judgment, it offered a kind of mercy, a fog thick enough to mute the anxiety that came from being watched and not watched, needed and not needed. Cosmetics had always been part of the training. Powders, pigments, scented oils. Their use was framed as enhancement, but also as concealment. Slight redness on the cheeks, a pallid tone beneath the eyes, dryness of the lips, all signs of weariness, were brushed away, replaced with idealized smoothness. The art of looking rested, even when you weren't. Over time, the lines between ritual, performance, and preservation blurred. Some applied layers with reverence, others mechanically. The mirror no longer reflected a self, but a requirement. And when the face beneath the paint began to betray the truth, the smoke of opium helped dull the realization. Looking beautiful became less about being seen and more about keeping invisible what time and strain had begun to reveal. Many didn't ask where the opium came from. It arrived, always. Sometimes mixed with wine, sometimes offered before performances, sometimes placed beside the bed on a tray with fresh cloths and cold water. Its presence was never questioned, nor was the knowledge that it slowed the pulse, relaxed the body, made the long hours pass in a haze that almost felt like comfort. And yet, behind the curtains and beneath the surface, the cost accumulated. Some boys forgot lines they once knew perfectly. Some missed their cue to bow or smiled a beat too late. Those mistakes were corrected with reminders, not always harsh, but always enough to sharpen the fear. And the smoke, despite its gentleness, did not defend them from consequence. Over time, sleep became something chemical. They lay down not to rest, but to drift. The days blurred at the edges, and dreams, if they came at all, were slow, vague, and filled with colorless air. Some awoke feeling heavier, others not at all. The makeup masked their fatigue in the morning, and the opium masked their thoughts at night. In rare moments of lucidity, some wondered if this softness, this perpetual gentle glow, was what had been intended all along. Beauty not as expression, but as erasure. And so they continued, scented, powdered, drugged, and always quiet, because silence was beautiful, and beautiful boys did not complain. Violence was not a single act, nor a moment that could be pinpointed. It did not arrive with a scream or leave behind visible bruises. Instead, it settled over the halls like humidity, thick, invisible, and always present. It lived in the way doors were opened too quickly, in footsteps that paused too long outside certain rooms, in the sharp glances that followed a misplayed note or a dropped fan. It was in the silences after laughter, in the stillness after music. No one spoke of it directly. No one had to. It didn't need to be declared. It hung in the air, like the scent of lacquer and dried flowers. And for the boys who lived in those lacquered chambers, it shaped everything, even their posture, their voice, their sleep. Sometimes a boy was removed from a gathering for speaking too freely. No one saw what happened next. He would return quieter, or not at all. Sometimes laughter erupted too loud during a poetry recital, and afterward the room grew colder for days. Punishments weren't always seen. That was part of their power. A servant would whisper of one who had been reassigned. Another might mention a name that should not be said anymore. The warnings weren't spoken as threats, but as facts, like the weather. You knew when it was about to rain. You knew when a smile was too forced. And you learned, gradually, how to read the signs, how to avoid the lightning by never standing too tall. Even the tutors carried it with them. Their hands, always still and graceful when demonstrating calligraphy, could tremble slightly when interrupted. Their eyes flicked toward the curtain, the door, the ceiling, anywhere that might conceal a listener. When a boy stumbled over a verse or mispronounced a name, the tutor might pause too long before correcting him, weighing the risk of mercy. And the boys, in turn, watched each other, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. If someone else was noticed, perhaps they would be spared. It was not a game. It was not a test. It was survival in a system that demanded stillness, beauty, and silence, but enforced them with shadows. Over time, the fear became ordinary. You didn't flinch anymore. You didn't ask. You simply adjusted. You kept your voice lower, your gestures smoother, your eyes lowered just enough. You learned to sense the shifts in tone, the changes in temperature. You became part of the atmosphere, graceful, obedient, and forgettable. And that, too, was a kind of victory, because the ones who were remembered too much, noticed too brightly, or questioned too openly, those were the ones who disappeared. And so the violence never needed to shout. It only had to be present, like a chill in the bones, like a curtain that moved with no wind, like a silence that said, "Stay still." It was never spoken aloud, only murmured, and even then, never directly. Boys vanished in ways that were too quiet, too convenient. A slip on the stairs, a fall from a roof, a drowning in the garden pond during the evening mist. Each event was treated with ritual solemnity, incense, poems, a new silence. But no one asked why the boy had climbed so high at dusk, or how he had come to be alone by water when he wasn't permitted to leave his quarters. Servants cleaned the scene, tutors bowed their heads, and the others remained still, not out of respect, but calculation. Because to ask was to risk attention, and attention in that world was always a danger. The pressure was not one thing. It was a collection of everything: the enforced smiles, the endless performance, the gaze of those in power that reduced you to a shadow of your own body. Day after day, the boys lived inside beauty that was not their own. They were vessels for poems, puppets for music, ornaments in robes stitched by hands they never met. And if their voice cracked, or their hair grew in the wrong direction, or they wept where they shouldn't, they were corrected, not always violently, but thoroughly. Some adapted, others dulled, but some simply couldn't stay. And they found exits no one would name. Not all deaths were deliberate. Some were mistakes. A misjudged jump during a stolen moment of freedom on a balcony. A dose of sleeping powder taken too generously after too many sleepless nights. A breath held too long underwater, not because they wished to die, but because they wanted to disappear. The system could not allow such stories to exist, so they became accidents. Incense masked the truth. Official scrolls recorded only what was permitted. A tragic fall, one document might read. Sudden illness, another. But the other boys knew. They always knew. They had seen the slowness in the walk, the refusal to eat, the silence that stayed too long. And after each one, nothing changed. Another was brought in. Another name was given. The silk was ironed, the smile rehearsed. Life resumed, not because the death was unimportant, but because remembering it too clearly would make it real. And so they didn't speak. They didn't look up. They continued, each of them balancing on the edge of their own ledge, some literal, most not. And perhaps the saddest part was not the death itself, but how ordinary it became, how expected, how accepted, as though the system was not failing, but functioning exactly as it was built to. They did not graduate. There was no ceremony, no farewell. One day they were simply not there anymore. Their bed was folded, their garments packed, their name quietly unspoken. And for those who remained, the silence around it was more terrifying than the absence itself. Because if someone could be erased without noise, then anyone could follow. But for the few who survived long enough, past their usefulness, past the glow of their youth, there was a path, not of honor, not of choice, but of redirection. The palace did not keep what it no longer needed. It repurposed. It reassigned. It rewrapped the boy in another name, another robe, another story. Sometimes they were made servants, not the kind with visible tasks, but the ones who moved between corridors unseen, guiding guests or reciting poetry in the background of noble banquets. Their presence was meant to be atmospheric, not personal. They stood close to power, but never touched it. Their training had taught them to disappear while still in the room. Others were sent to smaller courts, gifted like fine lacquerware to distant governors or allied nobles. In these places, they were introduced not as remnants, but as artists, as refined curiosities. The truth of their origin was never mentioned, and if their smile seemed too practiced, too slow, well, that only added to the charm. A rare few attempted rebirth. They shaved their heads, joined monasteries, took vows of silence that required no explanation. It was a form of vanishing that looked like peace. Whether it ever became real peace, no one could say. They kept their backs straight and eyes lowered, just as they had been taught. Some of them even believed the new name. Eventually. But the palace stayed with them, in the way they walked, in the way they touched objects without leaving prints, in the way they watched doors more than windows. You could always tell who they used to be if you knew what to look for. Not everyone did, and the world made room for them in its own quiet way. Cities are built to absorb stories without asking. A boy arrives, no longer a boy, with no papers, no past, and someone finds him a position, perhaps at a tea house or in a theater, or among clerks in the outer ministries. He speaks with elegance. He moves without noise. He is pleasant but unknowable. People like him, but never ask too much. And so he survives. Not in joy, not even in grief, but in continuation. He becomes someone else, not by choice, but by necessity. Because to remember too clearly who he was would mean remembering who took him there. And that is something no one can afford to do. The law came suddenly, but the change did not. Edicts were announced, scrolls were signed, officials rode through the capitals with declarations bound in red ribbon. In court, they spoke of morality, of modernity, of shame. The old systems, they said, were over. No more acquisitions, no more silked performances, no more boys with names not their own. From now on, the empire would be different. Enlightened, civilized, progressive. But laws live on paper, and paper does not travel far on muddy roads. In the northern villages, the news came late and left early. In the southern provinces, it never arrived at all. And in the homes where power had already taken root, no one asked what the scrolls said. They already had everything they wanted. In the cities, the signs changed. Certain doors were shuttered. Certain carriages no longer stopped near familiar gates. There were new words, too. phrases like reform and protection and respect for the child. Officials gave speeches, newspapers printed praise, missionaries nodded in solemn approval. But the buildings remained, the rooms remained, the patterns of silence remained. Only the names were different. Now it was called something else. Cultural study, perhaps, or music academy, or simply nothing at all, just a place behind a gate. And when a boy disappeared from his village, the explanation was gentler than before. He had gone to school. He had been adopted. He had talent. The story was softer. But the destination was the same. In the countryside, no one asked too many questions. A stranger might still arrive in the spring, asking if any children were especially beautiful or gifted. He would not wear the same clothes as before, and he would not speak with the same open confidence. But he would still leave with 1 or 2 boys trailing behind him, their belongings wrapped in cloth. Their parents would still sign papers, sometimes with thumbprints, sometimes with just a nod. And afterward, the village would return to its rhythm. Crops had to be planted. Animals had to be fed. The world was not waiting for moral progress. It was only waiting for the rain to stop. And if someone remembered the strange visitor months later, they would speak of him as they always had, not with judgment, but with a shrug. That's just how it had always been. Eventually, the empire changed. Truly changed. Wars came. Borders shifted. Thrones fell. New governments emerged with new uniforms, new slogans, new penalties. And yet, in private ledgers and whispered memories, the old stories remained. Some boys returned, years older, with quiet mouths and unfamiliar names. Others never came back. But in dusty drawers of provincial offices, the records continued for a while longer. Lists of gifts, notes about transfers, names carefully written in brush strokes beside meaningless numbers. And even after the record stopped, something lingered. A pattern, a habit, a silence. The system ended, yes. But not all at once. Not cleanly, not loudly. It faded the way things often do in history, not with a scream, but with a nod. On paper it ended. In practice it took longer, much longer than anyone was willing to admit. The past is not erased. It is rewritten, buried, folded beneath layers of new stories, new slogans, new priorities. In modern China, the archives of the past exist, but not all of them. Some scrolls remain sealed, others have vanished entirely. What happened in the halls of the Forbidden City, behind its lacquered doors and painted screens, is not taught in schoolrooms. No curriculum includes the names of the boys with painted faces and borrowed names. No textbooks describe the rooms that locked from the outside. The Qing dynasty is remembered for its grandeur, its art, its politics, but not its shadows. Those are left unmentioned, as if forgetting is a form of progress, as if silence can cleanse. There are records, of course, scattered across museums, buried in local collections, whispered about in Western academia, letters from missionaries, travelogues from disillusioned bureaucrats, poems that hint at things without naming them. But to speak of them openly, within China's borders, is something else. Even in universities, even among scholars, the topic is approached obliquely. The terminology is careful. Euphemisms are preferred. And when someone asks too directly about the role of the opera troupes, about the boys in silk robes, about who trained them and why, there is a pause, a shift, a redirection. Not because the facts are disputed, but because the facts are inconvenient. Not everything that is true is allowed to be remembered. The government does not deny it. Not exactly. It simply does not confirm. It does not display. It does not include. Museums may show costumes and calligraphy, but not context. Historical series on state television might portray emperors and concubines, but not the boys who stood between them, offering tea with lowered eyes. And if someone were to ask about the archives, about why certain files are missing or redacted, they would be met with bureaucracy, not answers. The illusion is not that the past was different. The illusion is that it does not matter. That what happened behind closed doors is irrelevant to the nation that now rises with steel and satellites. That beauty, suffering, exploitation, and silence are footnotes, not foundations. But the silence is telling. The refusal to speak becomes a kind of admission. In the age of digital transparency, absence becomes evidence. The more completely something is ignored, the more important it begins to seem. Why are there no monuments? Why are there no names? Why are there no descendants who speak of great-grandfathers who once performed in the inner court? Because there is no pride to inherit. Only pain. Only utility. Only loss. And so modern China moves forward, fast and bright, its past carefully curated for maximum glory. The Forbidden City remains, perfectly restored, open to tourists, glowing under golden lights. But its ghosts have no guides, no plaques, no explanations, just corridors that feel too quiet and rooms that no one stands in for long. They could not speak plainly, so they wrote carefully. Line by line, verse by verse, the poets of the Qing court walked a narrow path between beauty and treason. They understood the rules, but more importantly, they understood what was never written down. They knew about the boys in red sleeves and scented hair. They had seen them behind fans, behind doors, behind the emperor's eyes. And so they wrote not with accusation, but with distance. Not with anger, but with metaphors. A willow bending in the wind. A moon reflected in a still pond. A pair of sparrows forced to sing inside a golden cage. The censors allowed it. The court read it. The poets survived, because nothing was said, and everything was understood. Their work survives now, tucked into anthologies, etched onto scrolls, recited at festivals. Tourists admire the language, scholars praise the meter. But the meanings, those shift depending on who is reading. A line about longing might mean love, or absence, or obedience. A couplet about fading beauty might mourn a garden, or a boy, or a life behind palace walls. It was the only power they had, to observe, to remember, to encode. The poets did not storm the gates or raise their voices. They did not save the boys, but they made sure they were not completely forgotten. Hidden between brushstrokes, behind the symbols of plum blossoms and cranes, there is a record. You just have to know how to read it. Not all readers wanted to understand. Many preferred the surface, the rhymes, the elegance, the illusion of harmony. In a culture that valued restraint, silence became the highest form of speech. To name was to ruin. To accuse was to fail. So the poets whispered across time, trusting that someone, later, safer, might see what they saw. And some did. Modern scholars revisit these verses with new eyes. They trace the layers, the illusions, the patterns of sorrow too consistent to be coincidence. A boy described as a breeze across silk, a smile compared to a shadow that lingers but never stays. These are not the words of fantasy. They are memorials, gentle, precise, and grieving. And yet, even now, their voices are not loud. Their warnings remain wrapped in metaphor. The state does not ban these poems, it simply does not explain them. Their beauty is preserved, their meaning is left to drift, which is, perhaps, how the poets would have wanted it. Because to be too clear was to be punished, but to be too vague was to be useless. So they wrote at the edge of danger, just enough to be remembered, never enough to be stopped. Their verses endure not as rebellion, but as evidence, not loud, but lasting. A mirror held up to a time when silence was the only language left. There are records, volumes of them, ledgers detailing the selection process, edicts about behavior and attire, inventories of silks, perfumes, and musical instruments. Reports sent to court officials describing the upkeep of quarters, the expenditures for food, the assignments for each boy's daily routine. There are even poems, hundreds of them, written by courtiers, emperors, and scholars. Some are veiled in metaphor, others are oddly direct. All of them agree on one thing: this world existed. It was planned, maintained, and enforced. Bureaucrats tracked it, poets framed it, emperors relied on it. And yet, when you reach for a name, a single name, you find none. Not one. Not even a whisper of who they were. You might expect at least a courtesy name, a pseudonym, a hint. After all, their roles were specific. Their presence mattered. They were trained, dressed, assigned. They accompanied nobles to festivals, entertained ambassadors, stood behind folding screens in tense political negotiations, and still the documents remain clinical. One youth, they say, the boy from the south, the fourth of the new arrivals. It is as if they were ingredients, interchangeable, measured by age, skill, and appearance, but never by self. Their faces were observed, their bodies judged, their voices trained. But their names, the essence of memory, were erased at entry and never returned. Sometimes you find traces. A letter from a eunuch mentioning the boy who played the zither so well the empress wept. A diary entry about the one with the soft accent who asked about plum blossoms. But even these are fragments. No names, no family ties, no hometowns. It was not just neglect, it was design. They were not meant to be remembered. Their stories were meant to dissolve the moment they became part of the system. The state remembered only what was useful: the schedule, the expense, the performance. The rest, the soul, was an inconvenience, a risk. So it was removed. And now, centuries later, all that remains is silence. Their songs were sung, their dances watched, their beauty recorded in brushstrokes and second-hand verses. But their identities, gone. You can study the system, reconstruct the rituals, even find the architecture of the rooms they once inhabited. But you cannot call them. There is no one to answer. Their world was built on display and disappearance. The more visible they were, the less real they became. And so everything is documented, except the part that mattered. They lived, they served, they vanished. Not into legend, but into paperwork. A footnote in the empire, a ghost without a name. So that was their world, built on silence, wrapped in silk, and erased with precision. You followed it from the first quiet contract to the last missing name. No heroes, no villains, just a system that worked because no one asked too loudly what it cost. And now, you're lying there, in your own quiet room, breathing softer, maybe blinking slower. Let the weight of history settle, not on your shoulders, but into your pillow. Tomorrow, we'll wander into another forgotten hallway of time. But for now, rest. You're safe. You're not there. Not anymore. Good night.